The mist rolled in slowly at first, curling around the trees and sliding over the old, quiet streets. No one seemed to notice it at first. It was just a damp, milky white haze blanketing our little town, a quiet oddity in the late fall air. But that night, the mist grew thicker, hanging in the streets like a ghostly barrier. It was the night before Thanksgiving, and I remember standing on my porch, watching it twist and coil like something alive. I'd just returned to Maplewood for the holiday, a quaint town where I'd spent my childhood, nestled between miles of pine forests. It was a place I used to love, a town where everyone knew your name, your family, and often your business. That sense of familiarity was comforting. And yet, on that strange evening, something felt slightly off. The streets seemed emptier than they should have been. I could barely make out the row of old lampposts fading into the fog, each one disappearing into an opaque nothingness. The mist had an eerie quality. As it thickened, I began to feel as though it wasn't just obscuring things, but quietly rearranging them. The familiar houses and porches appeared just as they had in my memory, but something about them felt out of place. Shapes seemed to shift and stretch at the edge of my vision, bending in ways they shouldn't, and I found myself squinting to bring them into focus. And then I saw her. She was standing near the corner by the old bakery. Her silhouette was barely visible, draped in an old coat, her hair pulled back tightly. But even through the fog, I recognized her. Agnes, my high school English teacher. She had passed away 3 years ago. I froze, my pulse quickening, unable to convince myself that it was a trick of the fog. She looked like she was simply waiting. As I stared, she turned, her eyes meeting mine across the street, and I felt a chill spread through me. She lifted her hand slowly, as if in greeting, her face void of expression. The familiar glint of her glasses reflected the lamplight, and I could have sworn I saw her lips move, mouthing my name. I took a step back, heart hammering, my breath escaping in uneven puffs. I tried to look away, to shake off the absurdity of it all, but I couldn't move. She stood there, watching, and I felt something settle heavily in my stomach. Then I noticed another figure further down the street. This time it was Tom, the hardware store owner who'd passed just last spring. He was staring at me too, his hands hanging at his sides, his expression empty. And he wasn't alone. One by one, more figures began to appear, barely visible through the fog, each one a faint shadow of someone I once knew. By then, the street was crowded with them. They all seemed to be standing there, in quiet anticipation, gazing toward the houses, toward the living. I stumbled back into my house, slamming the door, my mind reeling with the impossible. The night was filled with strange, muffled sounds, as if there were footsteps just outside my window, quiet whispers in the mist. I didn't sleep that night, waiting for morning, hoping the fog would lift with the daylight. But as dawn approached, the mist only seemed to grow denser, pressing itself against the windows like a thick veil. I heard the sound of someone on my porch, the faint creak of the old boards underfoot. I peered through the blinds, but the mist was too thick to make out anything clearly. Yet, I felt it. Someone or something was waiting out there. Thanksgiving morning arrived, but no one in Maplewood felt much like celebrating. The fog hadn't lifted, and the eerie silence settled over the town like a weighted blanket. I barely saw a soul outside, as if everyone else had chosen to hide indoors. Yet, as the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that those figures were still there, lingering just out of sight. It was around noon when I heard a soft knock at my door. The knock was barely audible, a faint rapping as if someone were hesitant to disturb me. I stood by the door, every sense on edge, straining to catch the slightest sound on the other side. In the silence, the ticking of my kitchen clock felt unnaturally loud. I waited, holding my breath, but no second knock came. Just a lingering stillness, as if the house itself were listening. Finally, I worked up the courage to turn the knob. My hands were trembling, but I told myself it was nothing. Perhaps a neighbor, or maybe just the wind rattling the porch. I pulled the door open slowly, bracing myself. But when I stepped outside, the fog was all that greeted me, swirling around my feet in thick, milky waves. The street was empty as far as I could tell. The mist blurred the houses across from mine, hiding the familiar landmarks. Yet, I could feel something in that fog, a presence I couldn't explain, like an invisible crowd just beyond my line of sight. I shivered, glancing over my shoulder as I stepped back inside and closed the door, locking it this time. But then, as I turned away, my eyes fell on something on the floor just inside the doorway. A small, folded piece of paper, placed so neatly as though it had been slid under the door and left there deliberately. My heart raced as I bent down to pick it up, feeling the weight of dread settle over me. I unfolded the note carefully, hands steady but my mind spinning with apprehension. The message was written in the neat, looping handwriting of someone who had taken their time. Just 2 simple lines. "We remember you. It's time for you to remember us." A prickling chill traced down my spine. I read the words again, searching for some rational explanation, but none came. Who had left this? The letters on the paper seemed strange, the ink slightly smudged as if damp, but the words remained clear. They felt personal, somehow, almost as if they were directed at me alone. I closed the note and let it slip from my hand, watching it flutter to the floor. My mind raced back to the figures I had seen the night before. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's stories. But this went beyond anything I could explain. Those figures, those shadows of people who'd passed, they were still out there, lingering in the fog. It was nearing evening by then. I hadn't eaten all day. My stomach was twisted in knots. I sat by the window, staring out at the empty street, hoping to catch some sign of life, but the world remained shrouded, as if our town had been severed from everything beyond the mist. And then, in the dimming light, I began to notice something else. Shapes moving slowly up the road, forms that grew clearer as they approached. They moved with a strange, patient rhythm, almost like a procession. One by one, they filed into view. Faces I knew well, each one unmistakable. They were the people I had seen in the fog the night before, but now they were clearer, more solid. Agnes was there again, standing just as she had before, her coat hanging from her shoulders as she watched me from the road. Tom, too, and more people joined them, a quiet crowd gathering in the street. They stared at the house, their eyes fixed, unblinking. And then I saw him, at the very edge of the crowd, his face half hidden in the mist, stood my grandfather. He'd passed when I was a child, but I would have known him anywhere. His familiar gray cap, his weathered face. It was him, looking at me with a strange, penetrating gaze, as if he were searching for something I'd forgotten. I felt a lump in my throat, a confusing mixture of fear and longing. He raised his hand slowly, motioning as though he wanted me to come outside. I took a step back, instinct telling me to lock the door, to pull the curtains, to hide. But something in his eyes held me there, rooted in place. My hand reached for the door handle almost involuntarily. I could barely think, barely breathe. The fog pressed closer against the windows, the crowd thickening as more figures joined. I felt trapped, caught between the urge to open the door and the primal need to stay locked inside. Then, a whisper. A quiet murmur that seemed to drift through the fog and settle in my mind, as clear as any voice I'd ever heard. "Come, child. Come join us." I took another step back, my pulse hammering as the words echoed around me, each one filling the room with a haunting weight. I barely slept that night. The house felt colder, as if the walls themselves were gradually losing warmth. Shadows from the street lamp drifted across my walls, making odd shapes that seemed to pulse, as if they were breathing. I kept the lights on, lying on the couch with a blanket pulled to my chin, but nothing could stop the words from echoing in my mind. "Come join us." By morning, the fog hadn't lifted. It was thicker, denser, and the usual sounds of birds or passing cars were gone. I wondered if anyone else was feeling the same strange pull, that eerie sense of familiarity and dread. As I dressed, I tried not to think about the crowd outside my door or the way my grandfather's eyes seemed to follow me. I decided to walk into town, hoping to find something, some sign that I wasn't imagining all this. The streets were emptier than usual, though here and there, I saw figures moving within the fog. It felt wrong to approach them, so I kept my distance, walking quickly, almost as if I were running from something unseen. When I reached the town square, I realized just how quiet everything was. Shops were closed, lights off, and the streets were nearly empty. It felt like a ghost town. But as I turned down a familiar alley, I saw a small group of people standing together, talking in hushed voices. They looked over when they saw me, their expressions wary, like they, too, were seeing things they couldn't explain. I recognized one of them, Mrs. Barnes, an older woman who lived on the next street over. She approached me cautiously, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "You've seen them too, haven't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a murmur. I nodded, feeling a strange comfort in knowing I wasn't alone. She took a deep breath, her face pale and strained. "My husband," she whispered. "He's been gone for years, but last night I saw him, just standing there, in our garden, looking at me like he'd never left." Another woman stepped forward, clutching a scarf around her shoulders, her eyes wide with fear. "It's like they're all coming back. People we've lost, people who shouldn't be here." The group fell silent, each of us sharing an unspoken understanding. We all knew these apparitions weren't mere tricks of the light or figments of imagination. They were real as any of us. But why now? Why were they appearing just as the town was blanketed in this unnatural fog? One of the men, a wiry man named Jack, spoke up, his voice tight with nerves. "I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm not sticking around to find out what they want. My bags are packed, and I'm leaving tonight." A ripple of discomfort ran through the group, but no one spoke against his plan. I envied him, really. Something in me knew I should do the same, get as far from this place as possible. But another part of me, perhaps the part that had once sat at my grandfather's knee, listening to his stories, felt compelled to stay to understand what was happening. Mrs. Barnes looked at me, her gaze searching. "And you, dear? Will you stay? Or are you leaving too?" I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. I wasn't sure what I intended to do. I only knew that leaving felt as impossible as staying. The fog seemed to hold me here, as if it knew something I didn't. Before I could answer, the ground beneath us trembled slightly, a low rumble that seemed to echo up from deep below. We all froze, exchanging glances. The air felt thick, almost electric, and the distant outline of figures began to form again in the mist, moving towards us slowly. One by one, the group dispersed, fear overtaking any curiosity we might have had. I watched them go, my feet rooted to the ground as the shadows came closer, and there, at the edge of the square, I saw him again. My grandfather. His eyes met mine, calm and piercing, and he lifted his hand once more, beckoning. This time, his gaze felt insistent, as though he knew something vital that I didn't. I wanted to move, to turn and run, but his look held me there, bound as tightly as if I were wrapped in chains. Then, in a voice so faint it might have been my imagination, I heard him call my name. The sound wasn't loud, nor was it a whisper, but it filled me with a dreadful certainty. They weren't just here to haunt us. They wanted something deeper, something I couldn't begin to understand. I stepped back, finally breaking free of that paralyzing gaze, and fled down the empty street, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time I reached my house, the mist had thickened to an unnatural degree. Every corner, every familiar landmark, was hidden behind it, as if the fog had its own motives, its own intentions. I could no longer see the outline of the town square or the familiar rooftops across the street. The world had shrunk to the dim light from my windows and the small radius around my door. I stood there, catching my breath, half expecting the figure of my grandfather to appear once more. But the street was empty, devoid of even the quiet presence of other townsfolk. Somehow, that emptiness was worse than the crowd I'd faced the night before. Inside, the house felt unsettlingly still. I locked the door behind me, twisting the bolt with hands that trembled more than I cared to admit. For a moment, I allowed myself to rest against the door, listening to the soft, muffled silence. But as I moved through the rooms, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was out of place. Not something I could see or hear, just a quiet wrongness that seemed to cling to the air itself. I walked from room to room, checking each window, each door, every lock and latch, convincing myself it was only the fog that unnerved me. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. It was as if the very walls were aware of my every step, my every breath. My eyes fell on the dining table, where an old family photograph stood. I'd never been one for superstition, but at that moment, I felt compelled to turn it face down, as though that simple act could somehow shield me from whatever presence seemed to linger within the house. The image of my family, smiling and gathered around my grandfather, who sat at the head of the table, felt unbearable in that moment, as if I could sense the vacant eyes watching me through the glass. The minutes ticked by, heavy and languid, and soon I found myself pacing the room. Every small noise, every creak of the old wood, felt amplified, feeding into the swirling fear building within me. Then, suddenly, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. I turned, half expecting to see a shadow or some faint silhouette, but there was nothing. Only the fog, pressing against the window panes like a persistent tide. I tried to distract myself, to focus on small, grounding details, the familiar patterns on the worn rug, the faded colors of the wallpaper, but my mind kept slipping back to the words Mrs. Barnes had whispered in the square. They're coming back. Each of them as they were before. As the thoughts settled over me, I felt a coldness seep into the room, as if something had just walked in from the mist outside. My heart quickened. The lights flickered, and in that brief moment, I saw him again, my grandfather, standing in the doorway. He wasn't quite as I remembered. His clothes were the same, his face the same, but there was a stillness to him, a lifelessness that made my skin crawl. He looked at me with eyes that held a peculiar, vacant depth. He seemed almost content, as if he knew a secret I could never hope to grasp. "Grandfather," I managed, my voice barely more than a murmur. He said nothing, only gazed at me with that unsettling calm. And then he moved. Not a step, not a shift of weight, but rather a sort of glide, as though he were drifting through the room. The unnaturalness of it made me take a step back, pressing myself against the wall. He stopped, his face close to mine, and I felt an odd, almost magnetic pull, as though he wanted something from me, something unnameable yet unmistakable. His hand reached out, almost gentle, as if to touch my shoulder. I could see every crease in his skin, every line and mark that had once been so familiar to me, and yet they felt foreign, hollow, as if he were only a shell, something that barely remembered what it once was. Just as his hand was about to reach me, there was a sudden bang, a door slamming shut somewhere in the house. The sound jolted me from my trance, and I gasped, stumbling backward. The room was empty. He was gone, as if he had never been there. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But as I dialed, I realized I didn't know who to reach out to. Who could I possibly explain this to? What would I even say? And as I stared at the blank screen, I noticed something strange. My reflection in the glass seemed different. My own eyes looked back at me, yet there was a vacancy in them, a hint of that same lifeless calm I'd seen in my grandfather. I blinked, trying to shake off the sensation, but it lingered, creeping into my thoughts like a chill that went bone deep. I placed the phone down, suddenly aware that the fog had pressed itself right up against the windows, making it impossible to see beyond them. It was as though the entire town had been swallowed whole, wrapped in that dense, oppressive mist that held so many secrets, so many hidden faces. And somehow, deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The figures would return again and again until they found what they were looking for. The fog had an uncanny permanence to it, as if the entire town had been cocooned in a quiet, watchful net. I moved from room to room in the days that followed, an aimless drift. Any attempt to leave was halted by the dense mist, as if it wanted to remind me that we were all contained, trapped in this shrouded twilight. Each street was quiet, every porch empty, and every light in every house dim. We all seemed to be waiting. It was around noon on the third day when I heard the scratching. A faint, tentative scrape at first, like someone testing the strength of the wood on the front door. I froze, holding my breath as the sound grew sharper, more persistent. It didn't belong to an animal, nor to any branch blown by the wind. It was deliberate, human almost. I moved closer, keeping to the wall, feeling each step resonate in the pit of my stomach. The scraping stopped suddenly, leaving only the muffled, oppressive silence. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard my name spoken in a soft, almost pleading tone. It was a voice I hadn't heard in years, yet one that brought a jolt of recognition. "Ellen," it called again, my father's voice. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a rush of comfort. But I knew better. My father had been gone nearly a decade, his face a fading memory on the mantel. The handle was cold beneath my hand. I gripped it tightly, torn between the urge to turn it and the deep, primal warning in the back of my mind, urging me to stay put, to keep that barrier between myself and the unknown. But the voice called again, weaker, like he was losing his grip on this world. And though I knew it was wrong, knew that whatever waited beyond that door wasn't truly my father, I couldn't bring myself to ignore it. The door creaked open and I saw him. My father stood on the porch, exactly as he had looked in the last days I remembered him. A slight bend in his frame, the familiar creases around his eyes, and that tired smile he'd always worn, like he was apologizing for something he couldn't quite name. "Ellen, dear," he murmured, and for a terrible moment, I wanted to believe it was really him, that somehow he'd been brought back, a gift wrapped in fog. "Dad," I whispered, barely recognizing the hope in my own voice. He stepped forward, the mist curling around him in an embrace, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that unsettled me. It was as though he were looking through me, seeing something deeper, more essential than I was willing to reveal. I felt exposed under his gaze, every layer of myself stripped away. "It's time to come home, Ellen," he said, his voice softer than I remembered, almost coaxing. I took a step back, my hand still on the door, a hesitation building in me that he seemed to sense. His face fell slightly, and he reached out a hand, fingers extended, as though he needed something from me, something I didn't fully understand. "Come with me, Ellen," he repeated, a hint of urgency in his tone. "You belong with us now." The fog thickened, swirling around him, and I could see shadows moving within it, faint outlines of other faces, familiar and unfamiliar, blending and shifting like ghosts. My father's hand hung in the air, waiting, and I was struck by the odd sensation that if I took it, I would be lost, consumed by the fog, absorbed into that endless gray nothingness that stretched beyond the porch. I found my voice, though it came out shaky. "I can't. I don't belong there. Not yet." A flicker of something, disappointment, perhaps, crossed his face. He lowered his hand slowly, his gaze softening, almost sorrowful. The shadows around him grew denser, and I felt an overwhelming sadness radiate from him, as though he were trapped, as though he had come back only to deliver this invitation and was condemned to the mist until I accepted. He turned away, his figure dissolving into the fog, blending with the other shapes until he was nothing more than a faint outline. The mist lingered for a moment, as if reluctant to let go, and then it began to dissipate, leaving the porch empty once more. I closed the door, feeling the weight of something vast and ancient pressing down on me, as though I'd narrowly escaped some hidden trap that had been waiting just outside my door. The quiet settled over the house once more, heavy and oppressive, and I was left with the haunting echo of my father's voice calling my name. That night, sleep eluded me, my mind replaying the image of his face, the quiet plea in his eyes, as though he were caught in some terrible limbo, waiting for me to join him. And as I lay there, I realized with a sickening certainty that he would come again. They all would. The mist had begun to creep back, curling along the edges of the windows, pressing against the glass. It was patient, knowing that I would eventually have to face it, that I couldn't ignore its call forever. The days slipped by in that unsettling stillness, as if the entire town had fallen under an enchantment. People stayed indoors, visible only through parted curtains or as shadows drifting by dimly lit windows. The mist lingered, denser in some areas, thin enough in others to reveal the world in hazy fragments, like a memory that could no longer be trusted. I rarely left the house, dreading another encounter on the front porch, Yet something deeper kept urging me to seek answers. One afternoon, a gentle knock at my door shattered the silence. A small gasp escaped my lips as I stood frozen in the hallway. This time, it wasn't the scratching, but something more deliberate, courteous even. As if whoever was there wanted me to trust them, to welcome them in. With a measured breath, I cracked the door open. Standing on the doorstep was my neighbor, Margaret Lyle, her figure half buried in the mist. She looked more worn than I remembered, her cheeks hollowed, her eyes shadowed with the sleepless, watchful expression that had become a part of all of us in these strange days. "Ellen," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Do you have a moment? I don't think I can stay out here long." I nodded, gesturing for her to come inside, and she slipped past me quickly, as if she feared being followed. Once inside, she clutched her arms tightly around herself, trembling. "They're coming, Ellen," she said in a low voice. "They're coming for all of us." Her words hit me like a blast of cold air. "Who, Margaret? Who's coming?" She looked at me with a strained expression. Her lips pressed into a tight line as if the answer was too heavy, too monstrous to voice. She stepped closer, her hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. "It's the ones we left behind. The ones we mourned and buried and tried to forget." Her voice dropped to a fearful whisper. "They want us to take their place." My stomach twisted as I recalled my father's visit. His haunting plea to come with him, to leave this world for the gray emptiness he inhabited. I swallowed, bracing myself against the rising dread. "But why? Why now?" Margaret's grip tightened. "Because it's Thanksgiving. A time when we're supposed to be together. When families gather." Her face contorted with something between terror and resignation. "They think it's their turn." The words sank deep, unraveling my fragile calm. The fog, the silent streets, the shadows. It was all part of a plan, a twisted kind of reunion. And as Margaret spoke, I could sense them around us, pressing against the windows, lurking in the mist, waiting patiently. "I thought I saw my sister yesterday," she continued, her voice barely audible. I called out to her, and she looked at me with this hunger. It was as though she didn't recognize me, or didn't want to. A shiver ran through me. "What happened?" "She just watched," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking, but I felt something pull at me, like she was trying to draw me into her world. It was so close, Ellen. So close, I took her hand, grounding her as much as myself. "Margaret, we can't let them take us. This is our town, our lives." But as I said the words, I realized how weak they sounded. Whatever haunted our town had no regard for boundaries, no reverence for the living or the dead. They saw only their purpose, a singular, relentless need to take what they felt belonged to them. Margaret looked away, her gaze settling on the window. The mist was thickening, swirling just beyond the glass in shifting shapes and flickers of movement. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do we protect ourselves?" In that moment, I felt a strange clarity settle over me, as if the fog's presence had sharpened my instincts. "We stay together," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "If we scatter, they'll pick us off one by one. We need to be close to keep an eye on each other." Margaret nodded, though her face remained pale and drawn. She seemed comforted, if only slightly, by the plan, and I could see the barest flicker of hope in her tired eyes. But even as I spoke the words, I sensed the shadows closing in, tightening their grip on our town, waiting for the moment we let our guard slip. After Margaret left, I lit every light in the house, the small pools of warmth a feeble but comforting attempt to hold back the encroaching darkness. Yet no matter how brightly the bulbs glowed, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, seething with an intelligence I could feel rather than understand. That night, I sat by the door, a blanket wrapped around me, my eyes locked on the entryway, expecting another knock, another shadow waiting to reclaim what it believed was its own. Sleep had become elusive, a luxury I could no longer afford as the town seemed to settle deeper into its strange, chilling state. Each passing night made the fog thicker, more oppressive, swirling with unnatural vigor, as if it had a will of its own. I spent hours by the window, watching, waiting, straining my eyes to see any movement in the gray shroud that wrapped around us. But the shadows only hinted at forms that refused to fully reveal themselves. My days blurred into one long vigil, broken only by rare visits from those, like Margaret, who still had the courage to leave their homes. Fear bound us together, an unspoken pact to resist whatever forces lurked just beyond our doors. But the unease settled heavily in our bones. It showed in the way people looked at each other, as if every face held a new and sinister quality, as if any of us might no longer be quite ourselves. On the afternoon before Thanksgiving, Margaret came by again. She was accompanied by Robert Sykes, an older man who ran the small hardware shop on Main Street, and his wife, Lucille. They entered without a word, their faces etched with worry, their bodies trembling despite the warm coats they wore. I felt a strange relief at the sight of them. It was easier to bear this shared nightmare in company. We sat around the kitchen table, a somber gathering in my dimly lit home. Margaret broke the silence first. "We're running out of time, Ellen," she said, her voice strained. "They're closer than ever. They don't just linger outside anymore." Robert saw his own reflection. But it wasn't him. Robert shifted uneasily, his hands twisting together. "It was me, I suppose," he muttered, staring down at his knuckles. "But not quite. Something in the eyes, something missing. And when I moved, it moved with me, but there was a delay, like it wasn't sure how to imitate me." Lucille clutched her husband's arm. "And then she paused, her lips tightening as she looked away. "It smiled," she finished, her words like a low, frightened murmur. A silence fell over us, heavy and unyielding. I tried to imagine what it would be like to see my own likeness acting with an intent that didn't feel quite my own. The idea chilled me to the core, a feeling of being stripped from the inside out. My father's apparition had been disturbing, yes, but there had been something unmistakably him in it. This, though, the thought of a hollow version of myself, watching, learning, waiting. Margaret spoke again, her voice unsteady. "They're imitating us, aren't they? It's like they're practicing, figuring out how to take our place." Robert nodded. "We're the guests at their banquet," he said grimly. "But I don't think they mean for us to leave once we've arrived." The words hung in the air like a dreadful prophecy. We all understood the implication. This wasn't just a haunting. It was an invasion. They weren't content to watch us from the fog. They wanted more, our lives, our places, our very selves. And they wouldn't stop until they had taken what they came for. I swallowed hard, feeling a sudden desperation that left me breathless. "So what do we do?" I asked, searching their faces for any glimmer of hope. "How do we stop them?" For a moment, no one spoke. The gravity of our situation weighed heavily on us, a growing dread that seemed to seep into every corner of the room. Finally, Lucille cleared her throat, her voice soft but resolute. "We have to resist them," she said. "Whatever it takes. They feed on our weakness, our fear. If we show them that we're not afraid." Her voice broke off, and I realized how hollow the words sounded, even to her. It was one thing to speak of bravery in the safety of my kitchen, another entirely to face those shadowy doppelgangers, to resist the lure of loved ones returned from the grave, or to confront reflections that moved on their own. Margaret shuddered, gripping the edge of the table as if it was the only thing grounding her to reality. "But how long can we hold out?" she whispered. "They're only growing stronger, bolder, and we're only getting weaker." In that moment, a faint sound reached us, muffled by the walls but unmistakable. A low, rhythmic knock coming from the front door. The color drained from Robert's face as he looked at me, and I could see my own fear mirrored in his eyes. We sat frozen, too terrified to move. The knocking continued, a steady beat that seemed to grow louder, more insistent. It was as if the fog itself were demanding entry, pressing against the door, straining to breach the barrier that kept it at bay. Margaret's voice was barely a breath. "Don't answer it, Ellen," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "Whatever you do, don't let it in." The knocking persisted, a relentless rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. My fingers trembled as I reached out, gripping the edge of the table with white-knuckled hands. I could feel the others watching me, waiting for my response, their own fears reflected in their anxious gazes. And as I sat there, caught between terror and defiance, I realized that this was only the beginning. The fog was growing bolder, yes, but so was whatever lay within it. Thanksgiving was nearly here, and with it would come the culmination of their twisted plan. A gathering, a claiming, a feast that none of us would ever leave. The knocking stopped, but the silence it left behind felt even more ominous. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as if the world had drawn in a collective breath and was holding it, waiting. The fog had thickened to an impenetrable wall outside, and when I opened the door to look, I could scarcely see past the porch steps. The quiet pressed against me, amplifying every rustle, every creak of wood in the house, as though my home were settling into its own vigil. I busied myself in the kitchen, more out of habit than anything else. I set a pot of coffee to brew, my hands moving mechanically, each action strangely hollow. Margaret had promised she'd come by, but as the hours crept on, she never appeared. I tried calling her, but the line was dead, a sharp reminder of how isolated we'd become, each house a small, disconnected island in this fog-bound ocean. By noon, I found myself pacing, glancing at the clock every few minutes. I tried to read, to keep my mind occupied, but the words swam across the page, meaningless. My thoughts drifted back to the stories we'd shared around the kitchen table, the unsettling reflections, the unnatural doppelgangers. They had planted themselves in my mind, and every so often, I'd catch my own shadow flickering at the edge of my vision, making me flinch. Then, just as the light began to dim into afternoon, I heard the faint, familiar sound of footsteps outside. My heart leapt, and I rushed to the window, half expecting to see Margaret's figure emerging from the fog. But the figure approaching wasn't Margaret. I froze. It was my father. He was unmistakably there, his silhouette solid and real, moving steadily up the walkway. He wore the same old flannel shirt I remembered, his shoulders hunched in the way they always had been when he walked against a cold wind. Every detail was achingly familiar, down to the careful way he moved, as if he were afraid of startling me. but the look in his eyes as he glanced up at the window sent a chill deep into my bones. They were vacant, unseeing, almost glassy. I stumbled back from the window, pressing my hand to my mouth to stifle a gasp. The part of me that had longed to see him again warred with a primal fear, an instinctual urge to hide. He was here, undeniably present, but there was something about him, something hollow and wrong, that made my heart race with dread. A slow, measured knock echoed through the silence, reverberating off the walls. I didn't move, standing as still as a stone, barely daring to breathe. He knocked again, his hand tapping the door with a rhythm that seemed both patient and insistent, as if he knew I was there, waiting. "Ellen." His voice was a murmur through the door, soft and low, exactly as I remembered it. But there was no warmth, no hint of familiarity. It was as if he were repeating a word he didn't understand, testing its shape on his tongue. "Ellen, it's time to come outside." My hands clenched at my sides, and I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that when I opened them, he'd be gone. But the knocking continued, a steady, unrelenting beat that seemed to echo in my bones. I wanted to believe it was a dream, a terrible figment of my imagination, but every knock was a reminder of the cold, undeniable reality outside my door. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was even more oppressive, a thick, smothering weight. I felt a strange urge to open the door, to face him, to confront whatever was standing on my doorstep, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Moments passed, long, agonizing moments where I stood frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, I heard his footsteps retreating, fading into the distance until there was only silence once again. I sank to the floor, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I was alone, but the emptiness of the house felt somehow fuller, as though something unseen had slipped inside, settling itself into the corners and crevices, watching and waiting. For the rest of the afternoon, I stayed locked inside, too frightened to step beyond the threshold. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and unmoving, a silent witness to the horrors that lay beyond. Shadows shifted outside, barely visible through the gray, flickering like figures lurking just out of sight. As night fell, I lit every lamp in the house, desperate to stave off the darkness that seemed to creep ever closer. The hours dragged on, each one filled with a mounting sense of dread. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting another knock, another voice calling my name, another shade from my past come to reclaim me. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, I heard it, the faint, rhythmic knocking once again, steady and patient. The midnight knock was soft but steady, an unwavering rhythm that seemed to reach into the house and set every nerve on edge. I sat huddled by the kitchen table, unwilling to go near the door but unable to look away from it. The fog beyond the windows was so thick now that I felt as if I were peering into a boundless void. There were no shapes, no lights from other homes, just an endless gray mass pressing in, eager to seep into every crack and crevice of my house. "Ellen," the voice came again, muffled but insistent. It was my mother this time. I knew that voice well, could almost see her standing there with the slight tilt of her head she'd adopt when she was truly serious. Yet the voice was hollow, absent of warmth or familiarity, as if it were an imitation of something deeply cherished, a mimicry meant to unsettle, to coax. "Come home, Ellen. We're waiting for you." A feeling of betrayal gripped me. How dare they, I thought. How dare these apparitions were the faces and voices of those I loved, invading my home and dragging them into this grim parade. My mother, my father, these were people I had mourned deeply. I couldn't bear to think that something was using their memories to twist the knife. I sank into my chair, trembling, as the knock persisted. My resolve was failing. The thing outside was relentless, unwavering, and I began to feel as if the very walls of my house were bending under its pressure, the air becoming dense and suffocating. For the first time in my life, my own home felt foreign, as though it were conspiring against me, trapping me in. "Ellen, open the door," my mother's voice repeated, almost soothing now, drawing me in, weaving her tone through the silence. A strange compulsion took hold. Without realizing it, I stood up, my hands trembling as I took one step, then another, toward the door. It was as if my body had made up its mind independent of my will, a silent agreement that I was finally ready to face what waited on the other side. But before I could reach the door, I stopped, a spark of clarity cutting through the haze. I stumbled back, clutching the edge of the table, breathing heavily as I tried to regain control. I felt foolish, enraged even, at how easily I'd nearly given in. It wasn't my mother. Couldn't be. I wouldn't let myself believe that she, or any of the others I loved, would be part of this haunting mockery. Silence fell heavy and absolute. I waited, my breath hitching, hoping that the knocking would stop, that the voice would cease. But it only grew louder, the demand in it unmistakable, seeping through every wall, every piece of wood and glass, echoing in my mind as if the house itself were amplifying it. "Ellen," the voice intoned, low and insistent. "Come outside. It's time to come home." My hands clenched into fists, my fingernails digging into my palms as I fought the urge to answer. But there was something else I could feel now, a prickling awareness that I wasn't alone. It started as a barely perceptible feeling, an odd tension in the room, as if someone else were holding their breath. My eyes darted around, catching shadows cast by the lamps, flickering, stretching. Slowly, reluctantly, I turned to look over my shoulder, towards the hallway leading to the back of the house. I was almost afraid to blink, as if I might miss something, some shift in the darkness. And then I saw it, a figure standing at the end of the hall, half shrouded in shadow. It was myself, or at least something that looked like me. I froze, staring at the figure that wore my face, that stood with my posture, as though it had taken notes and learned every nuance of my presence. It wasn't moving, just watching, waiting, a silent replica that seemed to seep malice. I couldn't see its eyes clearly, but there was an intensity in its gaze, a knowledge that I knew too well. It wanted something. It wanted me, and as I stared, paralyzed, I realized with a sickening certainty that this was what lay on the other side of that door. The thing that had been calling me all night, luring me with voices I trusted. The knock wasn't meant to draw me outside. It was meant to replace me. Slowly, it began to move towards me, one careful step at a time, its expression twisting into a chilling mockery of my own face. A silent, sardonic smile crept across its features, a smile that held no warmth, no familiarity, only a ravenous hunger. I backed away, my heart racing, as the creature came closer, its eyes locked onto mine, mirroring my fear and helplessness back at me. I felt a surge of adrenaline, my mind racing for a way out. I knew I couldn't escape through the front door, where the voices of my family continued to beckon. There was no place left to run. Cornered, I took a step back, bumping into the table, feeling the wood dig into my spine as I pressed against it. The figure loomed closer, the air around it thickening with a presence that felt heavy and ancient, as though it carried the weight of countless others it had claimed before me. Desperate, I forced myself to look away, focusing on the small objects around the room, grounding myself in the reality of my home, trying to reclaim my space. But the creature only seemed to feed off my fear, growing bolder, more solid, until it was mere inches away. Its face so close to mine I could see the contours of my own features etched in mockery. Ellen, its voice was my own, low and mocking. It's time to come home. I don't know what impulse drove me then, but a surge of defiance rose within me, a refusal to be erased by this entity, to become just another memory that would be siphoned away into the fog. I clenched my fists, forcing my mind to clear, my thoughts sharpening with a strange, reckless clarity. This thing, whatever it was, wore my face, moved like me, but it could never be me. With my heart hammering, I took a slow, deliberate step forward, meeting its gaze with a strength I hadn't felt in hours. The thing's expression faltered. That twisted smile dimmed as confusion flickered in its eyes, a mirror of my own resistance. "I don't belong to you," I whispered, feeling the words reverberate through me like a spell. "And I'm not leaving this place." The figure paused, its smile fading completely, replaced by something darker, something ancient and bottomless. For a heartbeat, I thought it might lunge, and I braced myself, ready for whatever it would do. But then, like a fog breaking under the morning sun, its form began to waver, shifting and thinning, its edges fraying as if dissolving under some unseen force. I watched in breathless silence as it fell apart, piece by piece, unraveling like mist, until there was nothing left but the emptiness of the hallway, the distant sound of the night's quiet settling in around me. For the first time, I felt an overwhelming calm fill the house. The voices that had haunted me, the knocks, the imitations, all gone. I listened for anything, any lingering presence, but there was only silence. Stepping to the door, I peered out through the window. The fog had started to lift, revealing a few lights flickering from the homes nearby, and I could see the familiar outline of my neighborhood slowly coming back into focus. The dreadful heaviness that had weighed on everything had disappeared, leaving behind a stillness that felt pure, almost sacred. I knew, though, that I couldn't remain here. Something fundamental had shifted, and I didn't know if it would ever truly feel like home again. The faces, the voices, the mockery of the dead. I could still feel them lurking in the corners of my mind, shadows that might rise again one day. As the sun broke over the horizon, I grabbed a few things, locked the door behind me, and left. The house stood quiet, untouched, as I walked down the path, feeling the faint warmth of morning on my face. Behind me, my shadow stretched long and dark, like a distant echo, trailing after me but not catching up. For now, at least, I was free.